Naomi Brooks had just spent the last $10 in her wallet on a stranger's breakfast when the principal called to tell her that Lincoln Elementary's reading room would close in 30 days. She stood beneath the narrow awning outside Maple and Main Cafe, rain striking the pavement hard enough to blur the school across the street, while the white-haired man she had helped watched her expression change. Principal Harris spoke quietly, but the meaning was unmistakable. The district had lost a private grant, the building inspection required repairs, and every book would be packed into storage unless someone found $48,000 before Thanksgiving. Naomi pressed the phone closer to her ear, thinking of the children who ate lunch among those shelves because the reading room was warmer and quieter than their homes. She promised she would attend the emergency meeting that afternoon, although she had no idea how a third-grade teacher with $73 in her checking account could rescue an entire room. When she ended the call, the stranger asked whether something was wrong, and Naomi forced a small smile before answering that some mornings simply demanded more courage than others. Only minutes earlier, the payment terminal had rejected both of his cards, while impatient customers shifted behind him, and Naomi had stepped forward before embarrassment could harden the moment. His bill had been $7.40, leaving her with barely enough cash for the train home. Yet she had paid without asking his name or waiting for gratitude. The man had introduced himself only as Ethan, and nothing about his charcoal coat or measured voice suggested that newspapers regularly described him as one of Chicago's most influential investors. Ethan Caldwell had spent 30 years acquiring companies, restructuring debt, and turning failing institutions into profitable assets. But he had never learned what to do when a stranger offered kindness without calculating its return. He asked again whether he could repay her, and Naomi explained that repayment was unnecessary because help given during a difficult moment should not become another obligation. Her answer unsettled him more than the declined cards, because every relationship in his professional life seemed to arrive with conditions hidden beneath polite language. Naomi glanced toward the school and realized she would be late unless she left immediately, so she adjusted the worn leather bag filled with lesson plans and hurried into the rain. Ethan remained beneath the awning, holding the untouched coffee she had purchased, while the phrase 30 days repeated inside his mind. He had not meant to overhear the conversation, yet he understood enough to recognize financial distress, and distress was the language his career had taught him to read fluently. What Naomi could not know was that Caldwell Capital had recently purchased a portfolio of municipal properties from a failed development fund, including the aging commercial block beside Lincoln Elementary. His legal team had recommended converting the entire area into luxury apartments, a project that would increase nearby property values while placing additional pressure on the school district's lease agreements. Ethan had approved the preliminary review without studying the neighborhood because the proposal had appeared as another collection of numbers arranged across a screen. Inside her classroom, Naomi placed the emergency call behind her and greeted 28 children who carried worries far heavier than their backpacks. She began the morning with a story about a girl who crossed an ocean by following the stars, although 2 shelves behind her already stood half empty because damaged books had been removed after the inspection. During independent reading, Marcus Hill quietly asked whether the reading room would disappear, explaining that his older brother had heard teachers discussing boxes in the hallway. Naomi could have offered a comforting lie, but she believed children recognized dishonesty long before adults admitted using it. She told him the room was in trouble, yet people sometimes discovered solutions only after a problem became impossible to ignore. Marcus looked toward the remaining books and whispered that his mother could not afford any at home, which turned the funding crisis from an administrative problem into a promise Naomi could no longer abandon. That afternoon, teachers gathered inside the reading room while Principal Harris explained that the original grant had been withdrawn after the donor's company entered bankruptcy. Repairs to the heating system, water-damaged walls, and outdated electrical wiring would cost more than the district could authorize before winter. The room would therefore close, the books would be distributed among classrooms, and the after-school literacy program would end because no alternative space met safety requirements. Several teachers proposed fundraising events, but Naomi calculated that bake sales and donation jars could never raise $48,000 in 1 month. When she asked whether any corporation might sponsor the repairs, Harris admitted that the district had already approached several businesses, including Caldwell Capital, and received no commitment. The name meant little to Naomi, although one teacher muttered that companies like Caldwell did not invest in neighborhoods unless they could own what remained afterward. Across downtown, Ethan entered a conference room where architectural renderings of the Lincoln redevelopment project covered an illuminated screen. Rebecca Lawson, his longtime chief operating officer, summarized the expected returns while attorneys discussed tax incentives, zoning changes, and the declining value of several public facilities nearby. Ethan listened until a map appeared showing the elementary school beside the proposed construction zone, then asked why no community impact report had been included. The development director explained that the school was underfunded, structurally outdated, and likely to lose enrollment once rents increased, making eventual consolidation financially probable. Ethan thought of Naomi standing in the rain after spending her final cash on someone she believed needed help, and he felt the uncomfortable collision between a human face and a decision he had previously understood only as profitable. He ordered the project paused for 72 hours, surprising everyone at the table, then requested every report concerning Lincoln Elementary. That evening, Naomi returned to the empty reading room after the other teachers had gone home, carrying a cardboard box for books that children had not yet finished. She discovered Marcus asleep in a corner chair with an adventure novel resting against his chest, waiting for his mother to finish a second shift at the hospital cafeteria. Naomi covered him with her cardigan and sat beneath the flickering ceiling light, wondering how many lives could be quietly altered by closing one room. Her phone vibrated with an anonymous email containing only one sentence: "Do not trust anyone who suddenly offers to save Lincoln Elementary." Attached was a photograph of a redevelopment map bearing the Caldwell Capital logo, with the school circled in red and the words Phase 2 written beneath it. Naomi studied the image while footsteps approached from the dark hallway, unaware that the stranger from the cafe had just entered the building carrying an envelope with exactly $7.40. Ethan stopped outside the reading room when he saw Naomi seated beneath the failing light, the redevelopment map glowing on her phone while Marcus slept nearby. He had expected to return her money, offer a respectful apology for overhearing the call, and leave before his presence complicated her evening, but the photograph changed everything. Naomi looked from the Caldwell Capital logo to his face, then quickly locked the screen because she still knew him only as Ethan, the man whose bank cards had failed during breakfast. He noticed the defensive movement and understood that someone had already connected her school to his company, although he could not ask about the message without revealing how much he knew. Instead, he held out the envelope and explained that he had counted every cent because returning more would turn gratitude into a performance. Naomi accepted the envelope, smiled faintly at the precision, then asked why a man who spoke like a contract attorney had been unable to purchase coffee with two different cards. The question was reasonable, yet Ethan answered only that his bank had frozen several accounts after detecting suspicious activity, which was technically true and strategically incomplete. Earlier that morning, his cybersecurity team had blocked his personal cards after an attempted breach, but he had chosen the neighborhood cafe because he wanted 1 hour beyond the reach of assistants and drivers. Naomi studied him long enough to sense the omission, although Marcus shifted in his chair before she could challenge it. She explained that the boy's mother was delayed and that he often waited in the reading room because the after-school program provided the only dependable place between dismissal and home. Ethan looked around at the stained walls, aging radiators, and shelves repaired with mismatched screws, realizing that his development team had described this space as an inefficient asset. Nothing in their report mentioned the handwritten recommendations tucked inside books, or the drawings children had taped beside their favorite characters. When Marcus awakened, he recognized Ethan from the cafe and immediately asked whether he liked mysteries. because adults who wore serious coats usually had secrets. Naomi tried to redirect him, but Ethan admitted that the observation was probably accurate, which made the boy laugh before returning to his book. A few minutes later, Marcus's mother arrived breathless and apologetic, still wearing her cafeteria uniform beneath a winter jacket. Naomi reassured her without judgment, then quietly placed 2 sandwiches and an apple inside Marcus's backpack before they left. Ethan watched the exchange with the same discomfort he felt during corporate charity dinners, where wealthy guests discussed poverty while leaving untouched meals on expensive tables. After the door closed, he asked how often Naomi provided food, and she answered that children learned poorly when hunger occupied every thought. She did not call it charity, because naming every decent act seemed to her like asking the world to applaud. Ethan offered to carry the box of books to her classroom, and Naomi allowed him because refusing practical help would have been another form of pride. As they crossed the hallway, she asked whether he knew anything about Caldwell Capital, keeping her tone deliberately casual. Ethan felt the truth reach his throat and stopped there, because revealing himself beside a frightened schoolteacher holding evidence against his company seemed less like honesty than control. He said that he knew the firm by reputation, which caused Naomi to describe the anonymous warning and show him the redevelopment map. The document appeared authentic, but the Phase 2 label did not match any version Ethan had reviewed, and the red circle looked like an internal planning annotation. He realized that someone with access to Caldwell systems wanted the teachers to believe the school had already been marked for removal. Naomi expected him to dismiss the message as a prank, yet Ethan asked precise questions about the sender, attachment metadata, and timing. His familiarity with corporate documents made her suspicion sharpen, especially when he noticed a revision code hidden in the bottom corner without enlarging the image. She asked again what kind of work he performed, and Ethan replied that he handled investments, which was truthful enough to sound rehearsed. Naomi stopped walking and told him that partial honesty still required another person to live inside the missing pieces. Her words landed quietly, carrying more weight than accusation, because she did not know how directly they described him. Ethan promised to examine the map if she forwarded it, but Naomi refused, explaining that evidence should not be surrendered to a stranger simply because he sounded competent. The following morning, Ethan gave the revision code to Rebecca, who traced it to Martin Vale, Caldwell Capital's senior development director. Martin claimed the image belonged to an abandoned planning draft created months earlier, although he could not explain why it had been sent anonymously to a teacher. He argued that activists often manipulated internal documents to obstruct profitable projects, then warned Ethan that delaying construction could cost investors millions. Rebecca remained silent until Martin left, after which she revealed that several neighborhood properties had been purchased through intermediary companies at unusually low prices. The transactions were legal on paper, but each seller had received notices predicting school closure and rising tax burdens shortly before accepting the offers. Someone appeared to be manufacturing panic, acquiring property cheaply, and expecting Caldwell Capital's redevelopment to validate the deception. Meanwhile, Naomi brought the anonymous message to Principal Harris, who reacted with more fear than surprise. He admitted that a representative from an unnamed property group had visited weeks earlier, suggesting the district relocate the reading program because the neighborhood would soon become unsuitable for families. Harris had dismissed the conversation, but the loss of the grant occurred only days later, making the sequence difficult to ignore. Naomi asked whether the donor's bankruptcy had been verified, and Harris confessed that the withdrawal letter had arrived through an attorney, rather than the foundation itself. They contacted the former donor's office and learned that the foundation had never canceled the grant. Payment had been redirected after someone submitted revised banking instructions using forged district letterhead. By noon, the missing $48,000 was no longer merely a funding crisis, but evidence of a coordinated scheme involving fraud, property pressure, and confidential development plans. Naomi returned to Maple and Main hoping to find Ethan, because his questions now seemed less suspicious than necessary, yet his usual table remained empty. On the television above the counter, A financial news segment showed Ethan Caldwell stepping from a black car outside his company headquarters. Naomi froze as the white-haired billionaire turned toward the cameras, wearing the same charcoal coat and composed expression she had trusted across a cafe table. Beneath his image, the headline announced that Caldwell Capital had temporarily suspended a major Chicago redevelopment after concerns about internal misconduct. Naomi understood in one brutal instant that the stranger had known exactly what the map meant, exactly whose company threatened her school, and exactly how much truth he had chosen to withhold. Naomi watched the television until the report ended, although the cafe around her seemed to recede beneath the weight of one clear conclusion. Ethan had not merely concealed wealth, he had listened while she described frightened children, forged documents, and a threatened school without admitting that every road led back to his company. The distinction mattered because she had trusted his concern as something freely given, when he had possessed information capable of altering every conversation. She left the coffee untouched and walked directly to Lincoln Elementary, where Principal Harris was preparing documents for the district's fraud investigator. By the time Ethan called, Naomi had already decided that answering would give him another opportunity to manage the truth. She declined twice before sending a single message: "Do not contact me again unless you are prepared to speak in front of everyone affected." Ethan read the sentence inside his office, while Rebecca placed a growing stack of evidence across the table. Martin's development division had authorized consulting payments to 3 shell companies connected to the property purchases, and one consultant had previously represented the foundation whose grant money disappeared. None of the transfers carried Ethan's signature, yet all had occurred beneath a project he had approved without demanding sufficient scrutiny. Rebecca warned him that the board would advise secrecy until counsel determined criminal exposure, because public admission could damage investors, employees, and unrelated community programs. Ethan understood the argument, having made similar recommendations throughout his career, but Naomi's message left no room for carefully staged responsibility. He told Rebecca to arrange an independent audit, preserve every communication, and notify federal authorities before anyone inside Caldwell Capital could destroy evidence. The emergency community meeting took place that evening inside the school gymnasium, where folding chairs filled with parents, teachers, local residents, and reporters who had learned about the suspended redevelopment. Naomi stood beside Principal Harris, while Marcus and several children worked quietly in an adjoining classroom under volunteer supervision. Ethan arrived without attorneys, security officers, or prepared remarks, carrying only a folder of preliminary findings. His presence triggered angry questions before he reached the front, and several property owners accused Caldwell Capital of frightening families into selling their homes. Ethan did not interrupt or defend himself, because each person deserved to speak without being reduced to a public relations obstacle. When the room finally quieted, he admitted that his company had approved the redevelopment framework, that internal employees appeared connected to deceptive purchases, and that his failure to examine the human consequences had created the conditions in which abuse could thrive. Naomi listened from the first row, surprised by the absence of excuses, but unwilling to mistake confession for repair. She asked whether he had known his identity mattered while speaking with her, and Ethan answered that he had known from the beginning. He explained that he wanted to be treated without the expectations attached to his name, then acknowledged that his desire had required Naomi to participate in a relationship whose terms only he understood. The room became painfully still because the issue was no longer limited to money or development. It concerned the privilege of choosing when truth became convenient. Ethan said he had believed silence protected something genuine, when in reality, it protected him from the risk of being judged accurately. Naomi accepted the answer without forgiving him, then asked what Caldwell Capital would do before the investigation concluded and before the reading room closed. Ethan announced that the company would place the disputed properties into an independently administered trust, suspend every acquisition connected to Martin's division, and fund immediate safety repairs through a public emergency agreement requiring district oversight. A parent demanded to know whether the money represented another attempt to purchase goodwill, and Ethan replied that the school would owe Caldwell Capital nothing, including gratitude, naming rights, or future access. Naomi challenged him further, insisting that emergency repairs alone would not return stolen grant funds or protect residents pressured into selling. Ethan agreed, then presented a proposal allowing each seller to reverse the transaction at the original price plus expenses, while those choosing not to return would receive compensation determined by an outside mediator. The commitments were expensive, but Rebecca had confirmed they were legally possible, and Ethan believed anything less would preserve profit created through deception. Before the meeting could continue, Martin entered with 2 attorneys and accused Ethan of making reckless statements before evidence had been verified. He claimed the redevelopment map had been fabricated by neighborhood activists, while the shell companies provided legitimate market research unrelated to property pressure. Ethan asked whether Martin would explain the revised banking instructions used to redirect the literacy grant, and Martin answered that education funding had never fallen within his responsibilities. Naomi noticed that he denied involvement before Ethan mentioned any connection between the foundation's attorney and the shell companies. She asked how Martin knew the grant had been redirected rather than canceled, since that information had not yet been made public. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but the hesitation was enough for the reporters nearest the aisle to begin recording more carefully. Martin recovered quickly and suggested that Naomi had leaked confidential allegations to manipulate a wealthy donor. The accusation angered several parents, yet Naomi remained composed and asked Principal Harris to display the foundation's original transfer confirmation. The account number on the forged revision belonged to Lakeshore Educational Services, one of the shell companies listed in Rebecca's preliminary audit. Ethan then opened his folder and revealed that Martin had approved a payment to the same company for neighborhood transition research 2 days after the grant disappeared. The evidence did not prove that Martin personally forged documents, but it established a financial connection strong enough to justify immediate investigation. Federal agents waiting outside entered after Rebecca confirmed that Caldwell Capital had formally reported suspected fraud. As Martin was escorted from the gymnasium, he turned toward Ethan and warned that investors would destroy him for sacrificing an entire development over one decaying classroom. Ethan looked past him toward the children watching from the doorway and answered that the classroom had never been the smallest asset in the project, only the one his company had failed to value correctly. The crowd did not applaud because the damage remained too serious for a triumphant moment, and Ethan seemed relieved by their restraint. Naomi gathered her papers while parents surrounded district officials with questions about repairs and property claims. Before leaving, Ethan approached only close enough to be heard and said that he would honor her request by offering no private explanation. Naomi replied that public honesty was a beginning, not absolution, and Ethan accepted the distinction. Later that night, Naomi returned to the reading room and discovered that someone had slipped another anonymous envelope beneath the door. Inside was a copy of Martin's calendar showing repeated meetings with an individual identified only as RL, including one appointment scheduled for the following morning at Caldwell Capital. A handwritten note warned that Martin had not designed the scheme alone, and that the person protecting him still controlled the company's board. Naomi stared at the initials, remembering that Ethan's closest executive and trusted advisor was Rebecca Lawson, the woman who had managed every document presented at the meeting. Naomi did not call Ethan immediately because accusing Rebecca without verification could destroy the credibility they had only begun to establish. She photographed the calendar, sealed the original inside a plastic folder, and asked Principal Harris to place it in the school safe until investigators arrived. The next morning, however, the folder was gone, and the security camera covering the administrative hallway had stopped recording for 19 minutes during the night. Only 6 employees possessed keys to the office, yet there were no signs of forced entry or damage. Harris looked physically ill as he admitted that district administrators had pressured him for months to avoid conflict with developers, although he had never believed anyone inside the school would remove evidence. Naomi understood that the conspiracy reached beyond one corrupt executive and one frightened neighborhood, making trust increasingly dangerous. At Caldwell Capital, Ethan confronted Rebecca with the photograph Naomi had finally sent through the federal investigator assigned to the case. Rebecca studied the calendar and said the initials could refer to her, but she denied attending any secret meetings with Martin. She produced her official schedule, showing that she had been traveling during 2 listed appointments, then explained that Martin often used initials instead of names when arranging unofficial discussions. Ethan wanted to believe her because Rebecca had worked beside him for 22 years, surviving recessions, hostile takeovers, and the death of his wife, without once exploiting his grief. Loyalty, however, could not become a substitute for evidence, especially after he had already learned what happened when familiarity weakened scrutiny. He asked her to surrender her devices and take administrative leave until investigators confirmed the truth. Rebecca complied without anger, but before leaving, she warned Ethan that someone wanted him isolated from every person capable of recognizing manipulated records. She pointed out that the calendar paper carried an outdated Caldwell watermark, discontinued 3 years earlier, while Martin's current office used encrypted digital scheduling rather than printed pages. The document could still contain real information, yet it had likely been assembled from older materials to direct suspicion toward a convenient target. Ethan forwarded the observation to investigators and then called Naomi, not to defend Rebecca but to explain why the evidence required caution. Naomi appreciated the distinction, although she reminded him that the stolen original made delay equally dangerous. They agreed to meet at the school, with the federal investigator and district security, ensuring that neither controlled the setting or the information. During the meeting, an assistant custodian named Luis Ortega admitted that a district facilities supervisor had ordered him to disable the hallway camera for electrical maintenance. Luis had followed instructions because his immigration sponsorship depended on the contractor employing him, and he feared losing his job if he questioned authority. He had seen a woman enter the office wearing a hooded coat, but her height and movement did not resemble Rebecca. Naomi asked whether the woman carried anything distinctive, and Luis remembered a silver medical brace around her right wrist. Principal Harris quietly identified the district's deputy finance director, Rachel Lang, who had returned from surgery wearing exactly such a brace. The initials RL therefore pointed not to Rebecca Lawson but to Rachel Lang, the administrator responsible for processing external grants and approving facility closures. Investigators searched Rachel's office and discovered encrypted messages connecting her to Martin, along with draft notices predicting declining enrollment at schools located near Caldwell development sites. Rachel had redirected grant payments, delayed repairs, and recommended consolidations that weakened neighborhoods before private acquisitions began. Martin supplied confidential project timelines while Rachel manufactured public distress, allowing intermediaries to purchase property before redevelopment increased its value. Their scheme had operated for 4 years across 3 districts, yet Lincoln Elementary became the first site where a teacher questioned the sequence quickly enough to expose it. The anonymous warnings had come from Martin's executive assistant, who feared prosecution after discovering forged documents, but lacked the courage to identify herself openly. The revelation cleared Rebecca, yet it did not erase Ethan's responsibility for building a company where ambitious executives could hide exploitation beneath profitable summaries. He reinstated her only after the independent board committee confirmed she had repeatedly requested stronger community reviews that Martin suppressed before reaching Ethan. Rebecca confronted him privately, explaining that he had created an organization dependent on his final judgment while surrounding himself with people rewarded for bringing him certainty. Employees therefore learned to remove human complications before decisions reached his desk, because Ethan valued efficiency and rarely asked what had been excluded. The criticism hurt precisely because it was accurate. He had not ordered anyone to deceive families, but he had designed a culture where inconvenient lives disappeared inside polished presentations. Repairs began at Lincoln Elementary under district supervision, and Naomi insisted that teachers, parents, and neighborhood representatives review every expenditure. Ethan attended the first oversight meeting, but did not sit at the head of the table, choosing a chair near the back while residents debated priorities. Some wanted the reading room restored exactly as before, while others argued for heating repairs across the entire building before purchasing new books. Naomi supported the broader repairs, even though it delayed her cherished room, because compassion restricted to visible projects would repeat the same mistake in a gentler form. Ethan watched her persuade disappointed volunteers without dismissing their feelings, recognizing that leadership sometimes meant protecting people from the emotional appeal of an incomplete solution. Over the following weeks, Naomi and Ethan spoke only during public meetings, where their conversations remained courteous and focused on the school. Trust returned slowly through predictable behavior rather than dramatic gestures. Ethan disclosed conflicts before anyone asked, accepted criticism without retaliation, and rejected a proposal to name the renovated room after Caldwell Capital. Naomi began to see that his transformation did not depend upon whether she admired him, which made it more credible than any apology he could have delivered. Still, the emotional distance between them remained, because understanding why someone caused harm did not restore the innocence that existed before the truth. One afternoon, Marcus discovered Ethan repairing a loose bookshelf alongside volunteer carpenters and asked whether billionaires were allowed to use screwdrivers. Ethan replied that wealth did not improve coordination, especially when instructions had been written by someone who hated beginners. Marcus laughed, then handed him the correct bracket, while Naomi watched from the doorway. The moment carried no performance, no cameras, and no expectation that she would interpret it generously. When Ethan finished, he placed a worn mystery novel on the shelf and told Marcus that serious coats did indeed hide secrets, although some secrets became smaller when people finally told the truth. Naomi smiled despite herself, then noticed a district envelope resting on her desk. The letter announced that Lincoln Elementary would remain open, but Naomi's position had been eliminated after enrollment projections were revised for the coming year. She had exposed the fraud, protected the reading room, and helped preserve the school, yet budget restructuring would transfer her students to larger classes while leaving her without a classroom. At the bottom of the page, Rachel Lang's electronic approval remained embedded in the original decision, and district policy stated that reversing the termination required a public hearing within 10 days. Naomi folded the letter before anyone saw her hands tremble, realizing that the scheme could still take from her the one thing she had fought hardest to protect. Naomi told Principal Harris before the final bell, expecting sympathy but not rescue, because the district's staffing formula treated teachers as numbers tied to enrollment rather than relationships tied to children. Harris explained that Rachel had entered the revised projections months earlier, reducing Lincoln's expected population through assumptions now proven fraudulent. Although investigators had exposed the manipulation, the school board could not automatically reverse personnel decisions without reopening the entire budget, and several members feared legal challenges from other districts. Naomi had 10 days to appeal, yet she would need evidence showing that the corrected enrollment supported her position. The hearing would also become public, forcing parents to confront details about poverty, housing displacement, and family instability that many preferred to keep private. She refused Ethan's immediate offer of attorneys, explaining that his involvement could make a legitimate appeal appear purchased. Instead, Naomi organized the case with teachers, union representatives, and parents who chose voluntarily to participate. They reviewed enrollment records, transfer requests, housing data, and the reversed property sales that would allow several families to remain in the neighborhood. Marcus's mother provided testimony that the after-school program made continued employment possible, while other parents described how larger classes had affected children requiring individual support. Naomi never framed herself as indispensable because the hearing concerned whether the district had used corrupted data to erase a position serving real students. Ethan respected her boundary, but he instructed Caldwell Capital to release every non-privileged document concerning expected population changes, even though the information weakened the company's remaining development interests. The disclosure revealed that Martin had anticipated enrollment growth after redevelopment, while Rachel publicly projected decline, proving that officials used contradictory forecasts depending on whom they intended to persuade. 3 days before the hearing, Caldwell Capital's board demanded Ethan resign as chief executive. Several directors argued that his public concessions had cost the company hundreds of millions, exposed investors to lawsuits, and damaged confidence across every active project. They did not defend Martin's crimes, but they insisted that Ethan's emotional attachment to one teacher had distorted his judgment. Rebecca warned him that fighting the removal could consume months and make Naomi's appeal appear connected to a private relationship. Ethan therefore chose not to contest the vote, agreeing to step down after ensuring the independent restitution trust could not be dissolved by future leadership. When reporters asked whether Naomi had influenced his decisions, he answered that she had influenced his understanding, but every corrective action rested upon evidence his company should have examined long before meeting her. Naomi learned of his resignation through the news and found him that evening at Maple and Main, seated at the same table where their conversations had begun. For the first time, he looked less like a billionaire hiding behind simplicity and more like a tired man, uncertain what remained when professional identity disappeared. She asked whether he regretted exposing the scheme, and Ethan admitted that he regretted requiring a personal connection before recognizing harm visible to others for years. Losing his position frightened him, but keeping it by minimizing damage would have confirmed that every lesson he claimed to learn was temporary. Naomi told him that sacrifice did not automatically prove virtue, especially when powerful people could survive consequences that would destroy ordinary families. Ethan agreed, explaining that he did not expect admiration, only the right to make a better choice, while the choice still belonged to him. Their conversation moved beyond accusation for the first time, allowing grief, responsibility, and uncertainty to exist without becoming weapons. Ethan spoke about his late wife, Caroline, who had taught music in public schools before illness pulled her away from the classroom. After her death, he had buried himself inside expansion plans, because measurable success felt safer than loving anything vulnerable. Naomi understood the instinct, having watched her father lose his pension after a district restructuring, despite 30 years of teaching. She explained that his old wristwatch reminded her that institutions could forget people quickly, which was why she fought to make children feel seen before systems taught them otherwise. Neither history excused their mistakes, but each revealed why they had mistaken self-protection for strength. At the public hearing, the district attorney confirmed that Rachel's enrollment projections had been deliberately altered to support facility closures and staffing reductions. Caldwell Capital's records demonstrated that neighborhood population was expected to rise, while updated family registrations showed Lincoln would require another teacher rather than one fewer. Parents filled the chamber, not as an emotional audience but as witnesses carrying attendance reports, childcare schedules, housing agreements, and written consent for every personal detail presented. Naomi spoke last, telling the board that her position should be restored only if the evidence justified it, because justice weakened when individual sympathy replaced consistent standards. She asked them to correct the formula for every affected school, including those without reporters, wealthy corporations, or teachers willing to challenge authority. The board recessed for nearly 2 hours before returning with a unanimous decision. Naomi's position would be restored, Lincoln would receive an additional classroom aide, and every staffing action based on Rachel's projections would undergo independent review. More importantly, the district created a permanent community impact panel with voting seats for teachers, parents, and neighborhood representatives. The room erupted in relieved applause, but Naomi remained seated for a moment, absorbing the fact that the victory extended beyond her own job. Marcus rushed forward after the hearing and hugged her tightly, declaring that the reading room needed its best mystery expert. Naomi laughed through tears, while his mother thanked everyone who had refused to let quiet paperwork determine a child's future. Outside the district building, Ethan waited near the steps without assuming she wanted him inside the celebration. Naomi approached and told him that releasing the company records had made the decision possible. He replied that the records belonged to the truth, not to him, which sounded less polished than something he might once have said, and therefore more sincere. She invited him to the reopening of the reading room, explaining that the invitation came from the oversight committee rather than from forgiveness alone. Ethan accepted, then asked whether trust could ever become what it had been before. Naomi answered that she hoped it would not, because what existed before depended on ignorance, while anything worth building now would have to survive complete knowledge. On Thanksgiving morning, volunteers prepared the renovated room while children decorated paper leaves with the names of people who had helped them learn. Ethan arrived carrying no ceremonial check, only a box of used books collected from former Caldwell employees after Rebecca organized a private exchange. Naomi found the small white envelope containing $7.40 tucked between two novels, along with the original cafe receipt. Before she could ask why he had brought it, a fire alarm sounded through the school, and smoke began curling from the electrical cabinet outside the newly repaired reading room. The volunteers moved children toward the exits while Principal Harris called emergency services and custodians shut down power to the eastern wing. Ethan helped Marcus and two younger students through the nearest stairwell, while Naomi checked the reading room twice to ensure no child had hidden beneath tables during the confusion. Firefighters arrived within minutes and contained the smoke before flames reached the shelves, determining that an old junction box outside the renovated area had overheated under increased holiday usage. No one was injured, yet the incident exposed how narrowly the school's repairs had focused on visible spaces while neglecting infrastructure hidden behind walls. Naomi looked at the untouched books and understood that the emergency represented the final lesson of their year. Meaningful change could not stop where gratitude became easiest. The Oversight Committee redirected the remaining celebration funds toward a full electrical assessment, and Ethan proposed expanding the independent trust to support safety inspections across every high-risk school in the district. He no longer possessed executive authority at Caldwell Capital, but the board had honored the legally binding restitution agreement, while Rebecca used her position to maintain transparent cooperation. Ethan contributed personal funds only through the same public process required of every donor, accepting that responsible giving included surrendering control over recognition and outcome. Naomi supported the proposal after community representatives gained equal authority over priorities, ensuring that no wealthy participant could transform public need into private legacy. The reading room reopening was postponed, disappointing the children, but Marcus declared that mysteries were more exciting when everyone survived the final chapter. During the following months, Ethan built a smaller advisory firm focused on ethical redevelopment, hiring urban planners, tenant advocates, teachers, and neighborhood organizers before selecting financial analysts. The company earned less than Caldwell Capital, yet each project began with questions his former teams had treated as complications. Who would be displaced? Which institutions would absorb pressure, and who possessed the power to refuse? Rebecca joined the independent board rather than leaving Caldwell, believing reform required people willing to remain inside difficult systems without becoming loyal to their failures. Martin and Rachel eventually pleaded guilty to fraud, conspiracy, and theft of public funds after the executive assistant provided complete records in exchange for limited immunity. Restitution recovered most of the stolen grant money, while property owners received either reversed sales or court-approved compensation. Lincoln Elementary's reading room reopened the following spring with repaired wiring, restored walls, adjustable shelves, and no corporate name above the entrance. Instead, children selected a simple wooden sign reading, "The Open Door Library," because Marcus argued that every good story began when someone entered a place they had never seen before. Naomi resumed her reading circles beneath the wide windows, now supported by a classroom aide and volunteers trained through the district's expanded program. She continued purchasing used books when she found treasures worth sharing, although she no longer carried the burden alone. Parents organized monthly exchanges, Neighborhood restaurants donated meals during evening events, and retired residents recorded oral histories that students transformed into illustrated books. Ethan visited only when invited, sometimes speaking with older students about cities, money, and the moral consequences hidden inside ordinary decisions. He never presented himself as the man who saved the school, because the school had been preserved by teachers, parents, investigators, employees, and residents who refused convenient silence. Naomi noticed that he answered children's questions directly, including uncomfortable ones about why rich companies harmed poor neighborhoods. He explained that institutions often rewarded distance, allowing decision-makers to benefit from outcomes they never witnessed, and that responsibility began by refusing to confuse legality with fairness. His honesty lacked the clean redemption audiences preferred, yet Naomi trusted it because he no longer edited himself into a hero. One Saturday in September, nearly a year after the declined cards at Maple and Main, families gathered outside Lincoln Elementary for the launch of a free weekend reading program. Ethan arrived in jeans and a blue sweater, carrying boxes beside volunteers who knew him simply as another pair of hands. Naomi spent the morning matching children with books based on curiosity rather than ability, while Marcus proudly supervised the mystery table and corrected adults who placed detective stories beside fantasy novels. The maple tree near the playground had begun turning gold, scattering leaves across blankets, where parents read aloud beside their children. Nothing about the scene felt dramatic, yet every ordinary detail represented a future that had almost been removed through paperwork no child would ever understand. Near noon, Ethan found Naomi arranging donations inside the reading room and placed the familiar white envelope on the desk. The edges had softened, but the original receipt and $7.40 remained inside. He explained that he had carried it because the debt reminded him to examine what his decisions asked other people to pay. Naomi considered returning the money again, then looked toward a wooden donation box labeled "One More Story." She slipped the envelope inside and said that some debts should not be repaid to the person who created them, because gratitude became meaningful only when it traveled forward. Ethan smiled and asked whether that meant they were finally even. Naomi looked through the open door, where Marcus was helping a younger girl sound out the first page of a chapter book. She told Ethan that equality was never the point, because kindness was not a balance sheet, and trust was not an account restored by one perfect payment. What mattered was whether people allowed what they received to change how they treated the next person who depended on them. Ethan accepted the answer, then helped her carry another box toward the playground as though the conversation required no grand conclusion. Their shoulders brushed in the doorway, and neither stepped away, because affection had returned without disguising the history that made it cautious. Later, while volunteers packed tables beneath the setting sun, Naomi noticed her father's old watch had stopped. Ethan offered to take it to a jeweler, then paused and asked whether she preferred to handle it herself. The question was small, but it contained everything he had learned about consent, dignity, and the difference between helping someone and taking control. Naomi placed the watch in his palm and told him she trusted him to bring it back. Ethan closed his fingers gently around it, understanding that the object mattered far more than its price, and that trust returned through responsibilities no money could simplify. They left the school together, beneath the golden branches, passing the cafe, where a failed payment had once introduced two strangers living by incompatible definitions of wealth. Neither of them believed kindness could erase injustice, repair institutions by itself, or excuse the powerful from accountability. They had learned something more demanding. Compassion required truth. Truth required consequence. And consequence became worthwhile only when it changed future choices. Behind them, the reading room windows glowed as children continued turning pages, each story opening into possibilities that fraud, neglect, and silence had nearly taken away. $7.40 had never saved the school, but the choice surrounding that money had forced two people to decide who they would become once looking away was no longer possible.